Hey class, we're on to our fifth unit, right? This is the kind of turning point. We have three more big units after this. We don't have much longer left in the semester. I'm going to be putting up your larger essay possibilities, right? For the first essay up this week. And then we'll have a second one that you guys will do actually during the final exam period. You'll have time to work on it, and then for this, and then for the current one, you'll have an extra like 3 weeks right up until then. Excuse the sounds. There's construction nearby, and it's going to excite the dog, who's going to go running. There you go. Right. With that in mind, right, we're rounding the bend, as it were. We're already kind of through the halfway mark. This is the second half of the semester, right? We've covered a lot of ground, okay? We started with Lord's essays, which I've brought up a couple times throughout because I think they're very illustrative of points that we will discuss throughout the semester. And they've been relevant to bits of work that we've talked about and the like accordingly. Okay. We then moved into Citizen, right? Talking about a lot of things that Lord had covered, but with a more focus on a relatively, within the last decade, modern look at issues that Lord raised and that we obviously understand are still prominent in our society. Worked on that, went through it, talked about what it talks about, right? What does it make you think? How does it recontextualize things that have you've experienced or people have experienced or that you did not realize were experiences, right? With that in mind, we then moved into a discussion of a different marginalized group that's still relevant to Lord's original essays, of course, but we moved into a reading queer anthology, Poetry in a Time of Chaos. Talked a lot about how, as Lord had talked about, there's power in the erotic and the reclaiming and the importance of poetry to be able to allow marginalized voices to speak, right? And the transformative nature of kind of reclaiming poetry from this very sterile white Christian male perspective, right? Which actually is something I've been thinking a lot about because I'm doing my PhD exams, which require a whole lot of reading of kind of the traditional English canon. And thankfully I have thesis directors that are really on board with letting me kind of crack at that, right? But just the kind of existence of some of the what the canon looks like is inherently tied to these ideas, right? So interesting, right? In a Lonely Place, so that was our first novel. I was incorrect when I said it was our only one. We do have one more, which is a couple units after this, right? Which will be Toni Morrison's Beloved. But In a Lonely Place, right? We talked about the marginalized perspective, writing from the perspective of the oppressor or being able to recognize them, right? And call attention to it, right? That one is distinctly, most interestingly, I think, couched in discussions of how the marginalization that can come with gender roles can affect the lives of characters, let alone stories, right? And then we get to this one, right? So we're on another poetry collection here. Quantum Lyric by A. Van Jordan. It's not the author's only book. And I would argue it's not the only book that delves into Black experience. This one definitely does, right? The previous book to this is Magnolia, is similar in a lot of respects. You've probably noticed if you've taken the time to read through this first week, like I wanted you guys to, that Evan Jordan is very, very good at what we would call persona poems, right? So poems where a lot of times when we talk about poetry, there's, for most people, I think, a subconscious assumption that like the speaker, the person, the voice that the poem is coming from is somehow equivalent to the poet or is the poet, right, as an insertion, right? This is not always the case, and it's not always even a reasonable assumption. And it's a dangerous one to make in a critical sense, right? But here, I think that Jordan, when we talk about persona poems, it's when the speaker is very clearly like a character or another person that we inhabit. Magnolia is a previous book from this author. Is kind of very much like that. It's like biographical, and in Magnolia's head is a historical character, and so on and so forth. Right? Quantum Lyric does a lot of this. There's the inhabiting of the psyche of a great number of people, right? So we have a number of physicists and philosophers that get inhabited in here, right? Through Einstein, we have Schrodinger, and more, right? But also the other really interesting thing that this incorporates is something that we haven't talked too much about, but it's going to be very relevant again when we get to Under the Rock umbrella, right? Which is the role that popular culture can play in these things, in these discussions we've been having, right? So race, class, gender, so on and so forth. Where does pop culture's depiction of these things come in? We've had a little bit of a talk about this, right? So if we look back at Citizen, right, specifically kind of that breakdown of Serena Williams' career, right, and the just kind of her place in the media and how she's conceptualized and framed by tennis. It's a discussion of popular culture, but it's not exactly a broader sense, right? It's the pop culture of tennis, right, and how we react to tennis and athletes, right? This is kind of a more direct analog to popular media, right? Notably comic books, and even more specifically DC Comics, right? Which in itself is kind of like ATM Machine, Detective Comics, right? Automated Teller Machine, right? But that's what it's called, right? DC characters pop up a lot in this, right? And there's exploration of them as personas, and then them in relation to physics conundrums and theories and problems that are then used as essentially double entendres to talk about issues of race, right? So like the black body problem, very famous in kind of like an astrophysics sense, right? But also, the American culture has problems with black bodies, right? So there's interesting weight to put on that. You stick the Green Lantern in there as a character, it's like, okay, well, depending on which version of the Green Lantern you came up with, right, it could be a white or a black man, right? I would probably argue that here you're probably talking about a lot of times it makes me think of Jon Stewart, which is the Green Lantern that shows up in a lot of the DC animated stuff that came up through the 90s and the 2000s, right? But you don't have to know these characters super well. Some passing familiarity with them is interesting. I would argue at the time that this book originally came out, it would have probably been a more narrow focus on those things. So it was like 2007, right? We've had the extreme superhero boom of the past 10 years, right? Before the Marvel movie boom, DC was kind of king in that regard of like broader media exposure. Marvel was going bankrupt, et cetera, et cetera. So these characters would have been known, like the DC animated stuff was super common, but with the resurgence of interest in superheroes and their saturation through all layers of popular culture now, I think it's interesting to revisit this book. The reason I think it's worth focusing on its employment of popular culture is I want you guys to think about, if we go back to, again, discussions that Lord has had and that Claudia Rankine have brought up about kind of who frames the narrative, right? Or who frames media. Who's it made for? And then who's in control of how it's presented, right? For Lord's sake, I think consistently about this idea of you can't use, the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Like, you have to go outside the playbook. A system is established, and playing within the system will not dismantle the system. That's how the system is designed, right? Just to be impervious to damage from within, right? And then with Rankine, right, we have so much of an understanding of that, but particularly that Serena Williams chapter where it's just like, look at this white-dominated media space, right, and look at how they frame her as not just an athlete, but as a person, right, and how they deal with the problem of her blackness and her black body in that space, right, how it views it as a problem, right, and how clear that becomes, right. I don't think going through that chapter from Citizen, you could leave it without an understanding that like tennis has a problem with Serena Williams, or views her as a problem in some sense, which is horrible, right? Like innately horrible, and wrong, and any number of moral objections to it, which are entirely valid. But I think in a realistic sense, it seems obvious that tennis has that problem. The problem is with tennis, the community and its traditions and who controls its narrative, right? So now we come to kind of like the ultimate saturation, right, of how media is presented to us, which is popular culture, right? We have superheroes. These are things that we're supposed to, that are given to kids as, to be idealized and looked up to. They're superhuman, right? They're above human. They're better than us. We should aspire to, right? They have great morals and things like that. Again, right, there has been a push slowly and steadily to kind of diversify what those faces look like, right? Behind the mask, right? But the reality is that a lot of these characters come from a place of wealth and privilege and whiteness, right? So it's fascinating to see kind of a reclaiming of these things, or not even necessarily reclaiming, an exploration of what it can mean to have these figureheads encounter problems of blackness that they don't see in their comics, or rather they're usually not put up against in any way that's nuanced or lacking kind of a cringeworthy clumsiness in many regards of comics being less than delicate with a great number of issues, right? DC specifically has a very long history of very problematic relationships to female figures, and then besides that, kind of the co-opting of cultural imagery for character designs, right? If you go back and watch like the super old like Justice Friends or like Justice League cartoons, like the old ones, not like the 90s and 2000 ones, like the ones that like our parents were watching, my parents were watching. You watch some of those episodes, you're like, oh no, like why is this character named this? Like why is this character themed this way when they're clearly not of that culture or things like that. It gets very, very problematic in its stereotyping, right? This book, I think, does a really interesting job of blending a number of perspectives, right? So we have the internal monologue of these great minds, right? We have the reality of and complexities and kind of existentialism of what comes to be quantum physics, right? What does it mean to exist, and how do we quantify and identify existence, right? And then realities of blackness in America and the world, right? And then all put into this interesting lens of comic book characters encountering these things as they're blended, right? We're going to take the persona of this hero and we're going to make them encounter this thing, right? It's a fascinating blending, right? I usually recommend this book very often for early poetry readers. I think it's an easier read by virtue of being comprised of very approachable content, right? Even if it's the sciences and the like. Most people have had some exposure to these ideas, right? And unlike when we did Reading Queer, right, it's not that necessarily that some of those poems that most of those poems are hard to read. It's just like we discussed, most people aren't given the chance to be exposed to the erotic but in meaningful literature, right? Or in a way that it's not phrased in such a way that it's taboo, right? There's not that much in this book that I would argue is necessarily taboo, right? Instead, we're, aside from, I should say as a kind of an asterisk, the typical American difficulty to grapple with discussions of race, right? But these poems are very fun to read, right? And it's easy to get in people's heads. A lot of times they are set up as like a scene in a place, right? There's very narrative function to how these things work, right? So we can have like cut to an insert shot, society page review, City of Lights, right? Or cut to interior, Albert Einstein proposes a world government, 1932 day, right? So we have like scenes. The poems are scenes, right, for certain sections. You'll also notice that the book is divided into sections, which I think is fascinating, right? Something you can think about in your response, like why do you think it's broken up, how it's broken up. If you know anything about these comic characters or these historical figures, why are these the ones to choose? Why are we talking about them? Is there a specific perspective that they bring to the discussion that otherwise just wouldn't have been present, right? Think about these things, right? It's a fun book. I did place it at this point because, like I said, coming off of the first 4, right? It's been enjoyable reads dealing with relatively difficult content. Quantum Lyric does the same. There's complicated and important discussions to be had about this book, but I don't think it puts them to you in such a way that is immediately potentially traumatic, or at least unveiling of trauma, right? Under the Rock umbrella, it will also be, we'll have some of these, but it will be relatively light. We have a much broader discussion to have about that because we'll be looking again at a number of authors. Beloved is very intense, and then John DeGatta's one is intense for other reasons, right? But also just because, everything's stressful. We're less than a week out from an election. It's like, let's read ones that aren't going to just inundate us with some misery, especially coming out of Lonely Place, which is a very miserable book, right? It's bleak in a lot of ways that noir tends to be, right? In ways that are very real, okay? I hope you enjoy this book. It is a longtime favorite of mine. Your discussion board post should be going up. And then I'm going to give you guys the first essay to work with, right? What my thought for the first essay is, just to make it easier on you guys, what we're going to do for it is you're going to be able to take any of the discussion board posts that you've already written and extend that into essentially a longer paper. So if I asked you for 1,000 words, we're going to extend it to a 3,000 word paper, right? So you have basic subject matter to talk about, and we can expand from there. A large response to a book, right? So that's going to get posted up relatively soon. Really, really stoked about the work that you guys are doing. Super proud of you all, right? I'm sorry that this is going up so late. Like I mentioned, I'm doing my PhD exams, so this 2-week block, as is last week and this week through the end of October, I'm kind of in crazy crunch time. So I freely admit, just like you can see the stack of books behind me. I've been reading all those, and that's just for the second half of the exams, right? There was a whole bunch more. I have 31 pages of notes just for the first part. So I kind of lost track of time in studying, and then this admittedly slipped through the cracks. It's on me, right? With that being said, because of that, I'm going to let you guys trickle into the fullness of next week. Through the Friday, if you need to get this response done. I'll post up the new stuff, going into next week for Under the Rock umbrella, but we will kind of just, you have an extension on this one because I was so slow getting it up. Take care of yourselves, be safe. We're starting to see COVID spikes again. Don't get lax in taking care of yourselves, okay? The university likes to brag that there haven't been any in-classroom transmissions, which is A, no longer the case, and B, we can understand how kind of specific that rhetoric is. So take care of yourselves, be safe, right? Keep up on things. If you need help or extra time or anything like that, please reach out to me. We can have a conference call meeting via WebEx, super easy, right? Take care of yourselves. Thanks so much, and please enjoy the book. It's a blast.